There is loads of evidence for God before you even get to it. Evidenced by the fact, take yourself along to any university library, go to the philosophy of religion section, get a tape measure with you and measure how many shelves there are. There is vast amounts of discussion. The existence of God is taken incredibly seriously in academic philosophy. Just go ask someone like Quentin Smith, one of the world's leading atheist philosophers. Now, that doesn't mean it's good evidence, or it doesn't mean the evidence is convincing. Someone like Michael Ruse, another atheist philosopher, is on record as saying there are very, very good arguments for the existence of God. I do not think ultimately they are persuasive, but they are good arguments, and I have no time for fellow atheists who dismiss them. So be careful by sort of implying that, well, therefore there's nothing. Where would I begin? I would actually say there are many, many lines of evidence for the existence of God. You could begin philosophically and say the very fact that we can have a discussion like this, which implies that our minds are reliable agents for giving us truth, that consciousness exists, and so on. A whole suite of arguments around there. I think the argument from consciousness and reason is incredibly powerful. We could look at it, we can move into the sciences, and we could look at things like the mathematical precision underlying the universe, the fact that maths underpins the universe. That's persuaded many atheists down through history that something is going on. Take someone like Sir Fred Hoyle, British atheist physicist who coined the term Big Bang. He was deeply disturbed towards the end of his life by how mathematical the universe was, and saw where that was probably pointing. We could use arguments from the sciences. We could look at the fine-tuning of the universe. We might look at fine-tuning in biological life, the fact that all life is underwritten by biological programming language. Dawkins has talked about the fact that DNA looks like a programming language. I'm a computer programmer by my original training, and I can tell you that the programming language C++ did not arise spontaneously from the soup, but it was very cleverly designed, and we now build modern applications on top of it. Then we could move into the area of existential sort of arguments for the existence of God. There are arguments from beauty, arguments from desire, arguments from morality and ethics, all of those kind of things. And then we could come down through history and we could land on Jesus. And I think the evidence for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection, by the way, for which there's incredibly powerful historical evidence. What I find is interesting is not just the resurrection, but whom it happened to, the claims that Jesus made, and the life that was around those, and the way that stands up. So it depends where you want to go. But I would probably say, in a nutshell, if we had time, if we were down the pub together, not just me answering you online, I've probably got about 47 arguments for the existence of God, which would probably take about 10, 15 minutes to go through each of them in detail. So we'd have a very, very long session. It'd be a lot of fun. I would encourage you, read something. You may have done Feckenel, I don't know, but I would say it's really important. I really think it's important that as Christians, we read and engage with the best arguments on the atheist side. I challenge atheists to make sure you have engaged with the best on the Christian side. There's a lot of evidence for the existence of God. I can respect someone who looks at it and says, I'm not convinced, like Michael Ruse. I struggle to respect somebody who just thinks in sound bites. I'm not saying you're guilty of this, but someone who thinks in sound bites.
Well, I really think that's...
Blah, blah, blah. So exactly. So I'm dealing with somebody probably with greatest respect who hasn't thought these things through. So you're very welcome to continue throwing sound bites out, but I would be, if I was an atheist, I'd be a bit depressed at this. So
I think you've said that really well, Andy. And it reminds me of a recent video from Sean McDowell where he asked 100 apologists what they thought was the best argument for God's existence. And it was amazing to see the breadth of answers that were given from all of these different fields, all of these different sources. And even, Alex O'Connor was recently interviewing John Lennox, and he said one of the most powerful arguments to him of God's existence is the number of arguments, the variety of arguments, and even just the cumulative case for God's existence is really powerful to him. So I think you're right to point that out. And I think that
well, by the way, just because our little friend here has sort of said arguments on evidence, actually, that's not true, actually. Any philosopher looking at that would go, you've got to be kidding. But take one of the arguments that went through at high speed, mathematics. That was deeply persuasive to many atheists, because the evidence is this, and the data is this, that the universe is deeply mathematical, mathematically well. With the sciences. We couldn't do science without mathematics doing that. And the conundrum you run into if you're an atheist, or at least a materialistic atheist, if you try and cheat like someone like Peter Singer does and start smuggling in Platonism, but if you're going to be consistent and go, all we have are atoms and particles, okay, what is a number? What is the number 2? What is the number 5? Well, those are just human inventions, first actually invented by Mesopotamian goat herders sometime around about the 2nd millennium BC to keep track of their flocks. So then you run into the incredible paradox of how the hell do those things plug into physics? How on earth is it that we can use the invention of Mesopotamian goat herders to map the curvature of space-time, to measure the interior geometry of, collapsed stars and so on? Either those goat herders got incredibly lucky, or it turns out the base reality in physics is mathematical. And particularly when you get into quantum physics, this looks even more so. You've got sort of multidimensional probabilistic space. And to go, okay, so now this is getting problematic because numbers look like they exist in mind. Minds are the best places to locate numbers. And so it is not a surprise that you have many actually in physics, and particularly sort of quantum physics, heading in the sort of idea that the ultimate reality is some kind of mind. There are quite a lot of people in that space who are not Christians and are vague theists of some kind, because the evidence, not the argument, the evidence is the universe is a mathematical object. And that is a problem.
That's really good. And go ahead, Elise.
And by the way, I do love our little friend here. Second, another thing I'd point out to you, of course, if atheism is true, we can suitably ignore you because you are just a collection of atoms and particles, and all we have here is physics and chemistry. The fact that we don't think that and treat you with value and dignity is interesting, because I do find it interesting when, as an atheist, you wish to be taken seriously when actually truth doesn't matter. There is no such thing as mind. Consciousness is an illusion, to quote Daniel Dennett. And the whole thing is just quantum, it's just chemical bubbling. But the fact you'll continue to type away, I've just given you the answer to that, so we can go and rewatch the evidence. Go and rewatch that, and we can put a link in the show notes to the famous paper by Eugene Wigner, the Hungarian physicist in the 1950s, on the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and physical sciences. Go Google that, actually. Wigner, W-I-G-N-E-R, Eugene, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and physical sciences. Eugene was not a believer, but he was deeply convinced there was something bigger going on. He'll walk you through that, and you can read that at your leisure. There are some long words, but you'll have fun.
Well, I was going to say quickly, and then I know, Mike, you want to say something, is I recently got in a conversation on Facebook, actually, about the same question. There's no evidence for God, and everybody just says evidence for God. And so I was, engaging with this person, and I said, so, you want something concrete, right? Because some people want arguments. Some people want, well, give me, miracle or some sort of thing, right? So, okay, great. So let me, if you see a miracle, if you see somebody who's paralyzed, if you see them walking, so they're paralyzed and then they start walking, would you then believe, So I kind of go through this whole thing with this person. And they say, they want to see evidence, a miracle be evidence. So then I showed them a video of a woman. It's a video that they can watch and sent them a YouTube link of a woman, Delia Knox, who was paralyzed and is now walking, that I have known personally. And, then it was just like, oh, it's just some special faith healer that did it. And the reason why I raise this to you, Feckenel, is because what I oftentimes find is I think people say, well, I want this evidence. And then when they get it, they just say, well, that's not good enough. I want this, or that's not good enough. And I want this. And so it's like, it almost gets to a point where it's like, no matter how much evidence you give somebody, then they're going to still kind of say, this is not something that I'm never going to believe it. I'm just never going to accept the evidence. Even if God was to appear, let's just say God appeared and he showed, like, somehow I could magically DNA test God and know this is God, like this spirit, this whatever is God. Even if there's a way I was going to be able to do that, the reality is God did come to earth, and people still rejected him. So I do think my point is this: when it comes to belief, there will always be a way out. So I don't think people, I think, oftentimes have the expectation. I think Alex O'Connor gets stuck in this loop too, that I'll believe when there is an answer I can't give up. But what about this too? Or I could say this too. And people always assume that as long as I can say that, then that means that your answer isn't good enough. There's a hole. And I think you'll always be able to say those kind of things. People looked at Jesus, saw him do miracles, and still walked away from him. There's always going to be a way out. So the question you have to ask ourselves is, what makes sense? Kind of like the comprehensive case that Andy mentioned. What better answers that comprehensive case? What's the best answer for that?
The other issue as well, just as an aside, I have many favorite philosophers through history, but one of the interesting kind of British philosophers is a guy called A.J. Ayer, known as Freddie to his friends. He was the father of logical positivism, which is pretty much dead in philosophy, although it still hangs around in a few corners of the internet, and we're seeing a potentially example of it this evening. Ayer famously said that the deconstructor should be forced to wave the sword of deconstruction over his or her own cherished beliefs. And he didn't have a lot of time for his fellow atheists who were very fond of critiquing, say in this case, Christianity, but were not willing to turn around and subject their own views to criticism.